dive right in. Today, the first thing I want to talk about is how important it is to understand where we're at. And in order to begin the process of even understanding where we're at in terms of our readiness to make a significant change in our lives, we have to determine on the scale of the readiness to change scale. And there's actually there's a term for that. What I'm referring to is the theoretical framework known as stages of change. And by all means, please do look that up. In order for us to determine whether or not we're actually ready to make a significant change in our life, we have to first discern where we fall on that scale, on that readiness scale. And there's a number of significant milestones that have to first be attained and then surpassed in order to advance through those levels. So for the purpose of this exercise class, I mean, we could call it a class. It is essentially a class. For the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to talk about the specific categories first. So we'll be looking at, as I said, the theoretical framework, stages of change, and the categories or the levels through which we advance in order to become more ready to make significant changes in our lives are as follows: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. So once again, that's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. In order to go from pre-contemplation into contemplation, from contemplation into preparation, from preparation into action, and from action into maintenance, we actually have to accomplish some things. And it's kind of, what we're talking about here, it's not really important that we remember all these concepts or the frameworks or any of that stuff. What's important is that we begin to grasp the idea that, in fact, there are significant milestones that have to be met, and there are psychological barriers that will often prevent us from achieving those milestones. So once we recognize what those milestones are, then we can begin the process of truly understanding what it's going to take to ready ourselves to make change. So ultimately, we're talking about making change. That's a given. We're making big changes in our lives. We're making strides to do different things in our lives. But these changes, at their core, what they really refer to is a modification of our actual behavior. And that's a little bit more challenging than we might otherwise think. It's one thing to create a new habit, another thing entirely to create a new behavior. So if we're creating new behaviors, then we have to understand that there's a process, that we're in essence changing the way our brain functions, the way that we respond to stimulus in our environment, the way that we exist, the way that we see ourselves, our paradigm. And we're going to talk about the paradigm and the importance of a paradigm shift and where that falls in the stages of change spectrum. So let's start with pre-contemplation. This is I think it's best to illustrate what pre-contemplation is by kind of giving you a couple of examples. Pre-contemplation. So in pre-contemplation, let's say, for example, I get a DWI, and I have some personal experience with that. With pre-contemplation, I get that DWI, and I'm not making connections in my brain that I got that DWI because I might have a problem with drinking. No. I'm making the connection in my brain that I got that DWI for a host of other reasons that have nothing to do with my drinking. Because if I acknowledge that it's my drinking that's creating the problems in my life, that moves me towards making change. See where I'm going with this? Okay, so if I'm in pre-contemplation mode and I get that DWI, well, I got that DWI because that cop, quite frankly, was an asshole. Or because my taillight was out, or because the roads were wet and there was oil on them and it made my car swerve. It's for any host of reasons other than the fact that I got that DWI because I was drinking and driving, and maybe, just maybe, I have a problem with alcohol. So that's the mentality, that's the state of mind of somebody that's in pre-contemplation mode. Typically, pre-contemplation is, if you're watching this video, you either have a loved one that is in recovery or trying to get this recovery thing, or you're in recovery yourself. In either case, we're not talking about pre-contemplation anymore, because you're already making connections in your brain. The important takeaway with regard to pre-contemplation is that once we move beyond pre-contemplation into contemplation, you never go back to pre-contemplation. We will cycle through all the other stages of change consistently throughout the recovery process. It is a arduous process, but also an amazing one. I do want to make that very clear. The journey in recovery is the most amazing and wonderful thing you will ever do, or your loved one will ever do. It's the most amazing thing I ever did. When I finally gave up the fight, when I finally surrendered and began the process of modifying my behavior and healing and learning to love, and I mean all of the benefits that come along with active recovery, my gratitude is endless, and my life is more full than I could have ever imagined it, but I digress. In pre-contemplation, once we move past it into contemplation, we make those connections, we never go back. There's an expression that they use in 12-step rooms, and it's, once a cucumber becomes a pickle, it can never become a cucumber again. And I like that expression. You can't undo that connection that you make in your brain. And once you become aware of that, it's not to say you won't relapse again, or it's not to say you won't, or your loved one won't experiment again. What it is to say is that they're forever changed by the connection that's made in their brain. And then you have to progress, you have to move forward. At that point, you've gained some momentum, and you have to keep moving, and you have to keep learning and processing and getting this stuff. I want to just put a little caveat into all of this. If you don't remember any of these concepts or any of these like sort of highbrow theoretical frameworks, don't worry about that. It's not necessary that you retain any of this information, or that you Google it and print out a bunch of sheets and you learn the way that I learned it. I learned it because I taught this, and that was part of my educational process. And that's why I'm sharing it with you. But it's not necessary for you to learn it. What's important is that you grasp some of the ideas, and that when you walk away with that information, you go on to just work your program. And your program doesn't have to be complex. It can be very simple. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it can be extremely simple. If you just remember, well, if I work the 12 steps, if I do the 12 steps and I do them to the best of my ability, and I work with others, and I create a community around me, and I do all those things, I will get better. That's enough to remember for now. So that's my disclaimer to this information. So at any rate, once a cucumber becomes a pickle, it can never become a cucumber again. So we don't go back to pre-contemplation. But there's still a developmental milestone that we have to reach, and this is part of the process of getting ready to be able to change. And that developmental milestone is we're weighing the pros and cons of our active drinking and substance use. And the cons, the negative things that are occurring in our lives, like the DWIs, like the failed relationships, like the lost jobs, like the jails, the institutions, all of those things that are happening in our lives that are directly related to our use start to become really apparent. And all of the things that we liked about our substance use start to we start to recognize that maybe they're not real. Maybe they were for a short time in the very beginning. So the pros, in other words, what we enjoy about drinking or using drugs, and the cons, in other words, everything that's happening in our lives and our functioning as a result of our drinking and using, we're weighing those things in our head. This is not necessarily something that we're doing on a conscious level. I want to be clear on that. This is something that happens to everybody that seeks treatment at some point, but we may not be consciously aware of it. And that's okay. It's not necessary that we're consciously aware of it. It's still the developmental milestone. Babies aren't consciously aware of the fact that they're crawling so that they can learn how to walk, but they're still doing it. It's almost, that's more of an instinctual thing, but that's a good example in terms of the developmental milestone. So, weighing the pros and cons. Cons are heavily outweighing the pros, and we vie for change, and we start to move towards, we become ready, and we move towards making a significant change in our life. Okay, so now I'm going to move into, we've moved from pre-contemplation and now we're into contemplation. And this is, there it is, see? But before I do that, I have to do my, my blue steel. Is that good? Okay, so now we're in contemplation, and as you may have guessed, there's going to be a milestone, there's going to be a developmental process that has to occur. It has to sort of bake into the mental processes in order for us to advance into preparation. So from pre-contemplation into contemplation, it was the weighing of the pros and cons. From contemplation into preparation, there's a shift from what motivates us. So you may have surmised that when we get to that point, that contemplative state where we're making the connections in our brain, remember those connections can't be unmade, and we're moving towards making a significant change in our life, maybe seeking treatment or picking up the phone or asking our loved ones for help, or maybe this is the point, if you're a family of a loved one that's watching this, maybe this is the point at which your loved one reached out to you. That was the significant break in behavior, was the weighing of the pros and cons, even if it's on a subconscious level. Well, now there's a whole other set of circumstances, and it's important that the person who's recovering begin to look at what the motivating factors are for them in their recovery life. And we're talking about two specific types of motivations: extrinsic motivators and intrinsic motivators. So actually, I'll put them both up here. Extrinsic motivators and intrinsic motivators. So extrinsic is kind of just a fancy way of saying external, and intrinsic obviously is internal. So if we're being motivated by things outside of us, or if we're being motivated internally. And most of the time, people that are seeking treatment for the first, second, third, even fourth or fifth time, this is a process, and it's not always that way, but it can be a pretty harrowing experience if we're not armed with the pertinent requisite information to be successful at this. So typically what we find is that those persons are motivated extrinsically. There are extrinsic factors that are kind of shuttling them towards accessing treatment. And what I mean by this are, it's family. Sometimes it's legal situations, a nudge from the judge, so to speak, where there are consequences associated with not seeking treatment. Those are extrinsic motivators, and they're very useful. They are good tools in the beginning stage, but they don't last. That's the problem, is extrinsic motivators are only temporary. They will only get the person in recovery so far. So, sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year, sometimes a little bit longer, but eventually, if those extrinsic motivators don't become internalized, in other words, if they don't start to want to do this for themselves, for the betterment of themselves, for their own spiritual advancement, to be a better human being, a better citizen of the world, a better social steward, if you will, then the motivators, if they remain extrinsic, then it's just a matter of time before they're not enough anymore. Because what happens to those pros and cons in the recovery process? Well, the cons, the negative things that are happening in our lives, they start to go away, don't they? And as they start to go away, if the program works, if you're working a good program, they will definitively go away. They will get better. All of the things that are hanging over you, your relationships, your legal battles, your financial situation, all of those things will improve. That's just a given. If you stay sober and clean, those things are going to get better. And as they get better, they're no longer there to counterbalance the pros. And that's when the old thinking kicks back in. We call that addictive thinking. So when addictive thinking kicks back in, well, then it's like, without having the cons, those things that are significant that were happening in our lives when we first sought treatment, to steady ourselves, and only being motivated by extrinsic factors, well, those extrinsic motivators start dropping off along with the cons, don't they? They're usually very closely tied. So if you have legal issues, and that's part of your cons list, the motivator, the extrinsic motivator, might be a court, could be a judge that's saying you need to seek treatment or you're going to jail. That's a significant motivator. It's an extrinsic motivator, but it's a significant motivator. Well, 6 months, a year into your recovery, judge is like, great job, high five, and go on about your business, you're good. And that's no longer there. If your family is your extrinsic motivator, and they're like, you really need to get into treatment, or you're going to be homeless, or something to that effect, that's a really good motivator to get into treatment. But it's an extrinsic motivator, and that extrinsic motivator will also begin to resolve itself over time. Family starts to see that you're doing good, you're getting back your things back in order, you're showing up, you're present in your relationships with them. Now the family's not riding you, so to speak, and let's be honest, riding our loved ones into recovery is also only a temporary thing. If you're the families of a person in recovery, we need to be acutely aware of this. It doesn't work for the long term. The addiction is powerful. The processes in the brain are ingrained in our neural pathways. There is a physiological component to this. We have developed neural pathways in our brains that are the way we respond to stimulus in our environment, the way we cope with the world around us through substance use. So it is not as simple as shutting it off and saying, I'm going to be a good person. It's not a question of moral turpitude. We're talking about an illness, and we really, really need to be clear on that. So we've established what the extrinsic motivators are and that they're temporary. They'll get us into treatment, they'll get us moving in the recovery process, but they ain't gonna keep you there. So now we have to talk about that paradigm shift that occurs that we mentioned way earlier. A paradigm shift from extrinsic motivators to intrinsic motivators. Quintessential, important. So, what are intrinsic motivators? That's a little bit of a tougher nut to crack, so to speak, particularly for people that, and I include myself in that broad category, that are struggling and that have been struggling for a while, and then maybe don't think so highly of themselves, or maybe think exceptionally highly of themselves. There's a correlation there. But intrinsic value and intrinsic motivation is tough to grasp. It's tough for a person that's coming from this pleasure-seeking brain dysfunction that they've been exposed to for such a long period of time, to be able to think in terms of, where do I fit into my community? How do I grow spiritually? How do I become a better human being? How do I begin to seek happiness? And happiness is the probably single most important intrinsic motivator in our arsenal. And happiness is not a sustainable state. It's not something that you get to and then boom, you're there, you've achieved it, and you're done. It's something we work at for the rest of our lives. But it is a goal, it is an objective, and it can be a strong intrinsic motivator. So again, the milestone for moving from contemplation into preparation is that shift from extrinsic motivators to intrinsic motivators. That has to occur. How does that happen, you might say? How do we get there? Well, there's a lot of methodologies. Cognitive behavior therapy is very useful at beginning the process of going down this road, and another community-based methodology is 12 steps. The 12 steps, by their very nature, bring a person to a spiritual experience at the end of the 12 steps. That spiritual experience can be equated to a psychic change or a paradigm shift, and shifting from extrinsic motivators to intrinsic motivators. Same thing. And now we're moving on. So we've gone from pre-contemplation to contemplation, from contemplation into preparation. What's left? Action and maintenance. This video has gone on for quite a few minutes now, and I hope you've stuck with me. And please let me know if there's a better way, maybe some interactive kind of media components or something to kind of share this information with you. But understand that my purpose of doing this is really, I just want to first share with you sort of what we call psychological education. And second, let you know the framework that we're operating from at the Road. I'm going to conclude the first part of this video, Stages of Change video, here, and we'll have part 2, which will talk about action and maintenance. The developmental milestones that we're looking at there are effective communication, managing our thoughts, which is very closely correlated with cognitive behavior therapy, and emotional regulation, which also ties into like attachment dysregulation and somatic experience therapy, all of which are components of our program. So again, for the action stage of change, the developmental milestones, effective communication, managing our thoughts, and emotional regulation, we'll look at that in part 2. And we'll also look at maintenance, which is obviously a continuation of action, but there are certain things that we need to do and continue to accomplish in order for our recovery to start steamrolling through our life and become the dominant force that drives us and keeps us sane and happy and productive members of our society. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it didn't seem like too much information. I think it's good information, and just let me know. Thank you.